You may have Goodyear tires on your car or truck. Many Americans do. Goodyear is the leading tire manufacturer in this country. What you may not know is that the process of making these tires has led to horrendous impacts on the environment and human health. We think of tires as being made of rubber, derived from the sap of rubber trees, mostly from Southeast Asia, a process that's led to massive deforestation in the region. However, natural rubber makes up only a portion of a modern tire, usually around 19% in cars and 34% in trucks. The rest of the tire is made up of a mix of other materials, including synthetic rubber derived from petrochemicals and other chemical additives. In episode 16 of Chrysalis, I spoke with Dixon of Puget Soundkeeper about the toxic effects of one of the chemical additives in tires, called 6-PPD. A different chemical additive, which prevents tires from cracking, is produced using a chemical called orthotoluidine, or simply OT. This chemical causes bladder cancer, and it generates another chemical as a byproduct called diphenylamine, or DPA, which is a possible carcinogen that may damage the bladder, kidneys, and liver. Right now, I'm in Buffalo, New York, right next door to Niagara Falls, where there's a Goodyear plant that's been using orthotoluidine since 1957. Since the 1980s, at least 78 workers at Goodyear have developed bladder cancer, making it one of the nation's worst-known cancer clusters at a single workplace. Jim Morris is a Houston-based investigative journalist who has spent his career tracking the path of toxic chemicals through American industry and into the bloodstreams of workers. In his recent book, The Cancer Factory, Morris tells the story of workers at the Goodyear chemical plant in Niagara Falls who are exposed to orthotoluidine and what their plight reveals about the ongoing failure of American industry and government to protect its workers. I interviewed Jim live on stage at the University of Buffalo on September 26, 2024. In our conversation, we explore the failures to protect workers and the environment from deadly chemicals and what changes are needed to prevent these tragedies in the future. At the event, we were very lucky to have one of the Goodyear workers and bladder cancer victims in the audience. His name is Harry Wiest, and we invite him to say a few words at the beginning. Then, at the end, he comes on stage to participate in the question and answer session. Hearing from him directly, with tears in his eyes, is very powerful. This story is historical, but it is also very much alive in the present. Just a week before we recorded the interview, Jim broke another Goodyear story. This time, rather than being about workplace exposure, the story was about orthotoluidine pollution in the neighborhoods around Goodyear's Niagara Falls plant. Jim wrote the article together with Emily Watkins, an investigative reporter at WBFO, Buffalo's NPR station. Jim and his collaborators at Public Health Watch, WBFO, and Inside Climate News obtained previously undisclosed Department of Environmental Conservation documents through open records requests that show that Goodyear has been putting orthotoluidine in the air around its Niagara Falls plant at levels 1,000% higher than what New York state regulators now consider safe for the public to breathe. Here's what he and Emily Watkins write in the article. The state officially knew of the excess plant emissions no later than February 2023, when a Goodyear contractor submitted a report detailing test results. But a January 2010 email to Goodyear from Jacqueline DePronio, then an environmental program specialist with the DEC in Buffalo, suggests the state had suspicions about the pollution control equipment 13 years earlier. Whether it was a year and a half earlier or 13 years earlier, the Department of Environmental Conservation did not notify the public after it learned of the elevated orthotoluidine levels in the air. The families living near the plant in Niagara Falls did not know they were being exposed to elevated orthotoluidine levels until Jim and his collaborators published their reporting. Soon after they published this article and several follow-up articles, the Department of Conservation initiated a process that will force Goodyear to install new technology that brings the level of orthotoluidine emissions from the plant into compliance with current regulations. Many activists are still dissatisfied with how the state is addressing the problem, but Goodyear must now have the new pollution control technology installed and functioning by the end of October 2026. That's the power of great journalism. If you listen to my interview with Lois Gibbs that I released last week, a lot of this might sound familiar. Lois's husband in the 1970s worked at this same Goodyear plant, while she was at home fighting to uncover the truth about the chemicals buried under her Love Canal neighborhood. Jim quotes Lois Gibbs in his article, saying, "Nothing changes in Niagara Falls, nothing changes at the DEC." She also told him that emissions from Goodyear stacks used to fall on workers' vehicles in the plant parking lot and dissolve the paint. The company regularly paid to have the vehicles repainted. What is clear to me from all of these stories is that these chemical companies are run by people who have shown again and again that they are willing to put the lives of their workers and their neighbors at great risk in order to maximize profits for themselves. While government officials in New York have hardly showed a backbone or a sense of urgency with regard to Goodyear's toxic emissions, at least we're in New York, where we have some functioning environmental regulations. The role of state governments is more important than ever now that we have a president in the White House who calls environmental regulations illegitimate impediments. In July of 2025, President Trump gave 2-year exemptions from EPA emission standards to over 100 facilities, including chemical plants, refineries, and other polluting industries around the country. And the people who live in the neighborhoods around these facilities have limited, if any, information about what they and their children are breathing or drinking on a daily basis. As always, we need good journalism to expose the abuses of government and industry. Not surprisingly, Trump has also waged an unprecedented assault on journalism. Jim Morris is one of those essential journalists. He has won more than 85 awards, including the George Polk Award, the Sidney Hillman Award, 3 National Association of Science Writers Awards, and 3 Edward R. Murrow Awards. He is now the executive director and editor-in-chief at Public Health Watch. I'm John Fiege, and this is Chrysalis. You can subscribe at johnfiege.earth, where you will also find show notes and all episodes of the podcast, plus my writing, photographs, and films. Here is Jim Morris. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is John Fiege, and we're going to do a quick intro with Harry.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Harry Wiest. I worked for Goodyear for 34 years, and I'm one of the guys that got cancer from working there. And I'm telling you, you can't even make this stuff up. You know, it is such a wild story, and it's, you know, I lost a lot of my buddies. You know, a lot of people passed away, and they asked me, our lawyer, Steve Waka, who was involved heavily in this thing that went on in our plant, this big cancer epidemic, he called me in 2013 and said, "Harry, you're a pretty sharp guy. You like to talk and you're really knowledgeable." He said, "There's a guy that wants to do a story about this thing at Goodyear." And he says, "Would you sit down with him and could you help him with it?" I said, "Yeah, I could do that." So we got some people together, and I met Jim Morris. And I could tell he was pretty sharp. And he did a really, really great story in the Center, Public Integrity, right? Am I saying that right? And he came to our farm, and we did this. We lived out in Youngstown, and Jim has become more than a guy writing. He's become my friend. He's a great guy. And then I got a call, I believe, again, I think it was from Steve Waka and from Jim, saying that Jim was going to write a book and that if I could help him. And I said I would. And it is so close to my heart because not only did I have the cancer, but my father-in-law, who was my boss at Goodyear, he ended up getting it. And there's so many things involved in all that. It's just, you couldn't make this story up if you had to make up a story. So you guys are in for a nice treat with Jim. He's a great guy. And there's my phone. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.
All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. My name is John Fiege. I am a professor in the Department of Media Study here, and I'm affiliated with the Department of Environment and Sustainability. And I have a podcast called the Chrysalis Podcast. It's at chrysalispodcast.org. Please go sign up for it. Join our newsletter. We are a very small operation with no funding, and we have amazing people who help us, including two tonight, Casey Stewart from the Department of Environment and Sustainability, and Amy Kavanaugh, who is from the School of Public Health and Health Professionals. And Amy is the person responsible for getting Jim to do this event and come here. So thank you both for all your amazing work. And thank you, Jim, for agreeing to do this with us. All right. So, Jim, can you start by telling me where you grew up and what your relationship was to the air, the water, and the rest of the environment that was around you as a kid?
I was born in 1957 in Orange, Texas, which is an industrial hellhole right on the Louisiana line. And so all those chemicals I absorbed as a child probably explains why I am the way I am. My father worked for U.S. Steel for much of his career, so I was around, blue-collar workers, the steel industry, and so forth. And thinking back, maybe that's why I became so interested in blue-collar workers and factories and so forth. Started my newspaper career in Longview, Texas in 1978, and worked my way through a number of smaller papers, Fort Worth, out to California, back to Texas, up to DC for 22 years, and then back to Texas a little over 3 years ago, where I started Public Health Watch, which is a nonprofit news organization.
Great. So why investigative journalism? What got you interested in that in the first place?
I had the good fortune of working with a guy in California named Tom Harris. This was in the mid-'80s. Before then, I had done more traditional sort of beat journalism, daily coverage and so forth, which really didn't interest me. Wasn't that fulfilling, but that's kind of what you did. And then they assigned me to work with Tom, who was much older than I was, probably easily 20 years older than I was, who was the environment writer in Sacramento. And they put me on a big project with Tom, and that did it for me. I saw how he worked. He just kept digging and digging and going through documents and interviewing dozens and dozens of people. And in the end, we produced a series on military toxic waste that won the George Polk Award. And that definitely got my attention.
Oh, yeah.
I thought, okay, this is the track I want to be on. So from that point on, that's pretty much all I've done.
Oh, that's great. And in 1998, you were working on a year-long series for the Houston Chronicle about the chemical industry, and that's when you came across this bladder cancer cluster in Goodyear. Can you talk a little bit about that piece and what you were doing with it and how it came all the way up here to Niagara Falls?
Sure. So in 1998, I was an investigative reporter with the Houston Chronicle, and I was looking into the PVC industry. And those of you who know that industry know that there's a chemical called vinyl chloride, which is a very potent liver carcinogen. And I got a hold of a bunch of documents, a trove of documents showing that the PVC industry, and I think you all know what PVC is, garden hoses, shower curtains, et cetera, what they knew and what they didn't tell their workers about the cancer risk. So in the course of that investigation, I somehow found Steve Watka. I don't even remember how. This was 26 years ago. And I interviewed Steve briefly about what was going on in Niagara Falls. I interviewed Rod Halford, who was then, I think he had retired, but this was a long time ago. And I may have interviewed one more person, I don't remember. And it ended up being kind of a small section of a longer article. And then I forgot about it, really, for 15 years.
And then what?
Then in 2013, I was doing another investigation of the chemical industry, this time for the Center for Public Integrity. And I guess I just got curious. I wonder whatever happened in Niagara Falls. Because when I wrote that blurb, basically in 1998, I think the number of cases, bladder cancer cases, was in the high 20s. So I checked in again with Steve Wadka after 15 years, and he said, "You won't believe it, it's in the high 50s now." And so then I thought, okay, I've got to do something bigger. And I came up here to Niagara Falls, met Harry, met some of the other workers, some of the retirees, did a fairly long article with WXXI in Rochester, and came away thinking, I've got to do a book on this. It was just too much to limit to one article.
And what, from your perspective as a journalist, what was the point where you saw this as a book, this is a bigger story, rather than an article or a series of articles?
I think it was when I met Harry and the other workers and the retirees, and they opened up to me, and when I saw the trove of documents that Steve Wadka had. Steve is like a walking encyclopedia. And putting two and two together and having done this for quite a while, I kind of know when something's a story and when it's not. And I could see it was just way too big, to do as even a series of stories.
Right.
And I had thought about writing a book before when I was in Houston, but I vowed never to write a book until I had really strong characters. I didn't want to write some dry, policy book, sciencey book that no one would read.
Right.
And I figured it out pretty quickly that the folks up here were really compelling characters.
And so Harry and his late wife, Diane, and then her parents, Ray and Dottie, are the key characters of this book. How did they, there are a lot of workers who've gone through a lot, but why this group of people? Why did they become the center of this story for you? And what did you see there as a compelling narrative that you thought could bring this to a wider audience?
Well, in the beginning, because Harry was so generous with his time and was so forthcoming. Harry doesn't hold anything back, you may have noticed. And then Dottie, his mother-in-law, is also very outspoken in a different way, but very outspoken. Ray, his father-in-law, is very quiet, very stoic, doesn't talk a lot. But when I saw Ray and Harry together in particular, it was just a really interesting, or Ray and Dottie together, it was just a really interesting dynamic. You could see this issue from a number of perspectives. Patriarch of the family with bladder cancer who's much more about, don't make a big deal out of this. Yeah, it really sucks, but, they gave me a good living. His wife, Dottie, who was like, no, this is not right. And then Harry, who was much more vocal than Ray.
Yeah, and you can see that in the book. There's all this information about the history and the science and the politics, but at the core of it, there's these amazing characters and these human stories that are just heart-wrenching, but really compelling from a narrative perspective too. So I want to cover a little bit of history here. So I'm just going to kind of go through some of the timeline, early timeline. So in 1919, DuPont began manufacturing this chemical called ortho-toluidine. So in 1919, DuPont began manufacturing ortho-toluidine, which is a class of chemicals, in a class of chemicals called aromatic amides. And in 1895, a German surgeon had reported multiple cases of bladder cancer in workers exposed to this class of chemicals, the aromatic amides. When production of these chemicals ramped up in the United States, you write that DuPont paid no attention to the evidence of the dangers of these chemicals. But in the 1930s, another German doctor named Wilhelm Huber identified 23 cases of bladder cancer among DuPont workers. And in 1934, he wrote an article in the Journal of Industrial Hygiene predicting a wave of bladder cancer cases among workers exposed to these chemicals. So I was hoping you could talk a bit about how DuPont responded to their own workers getting sick, and what did the company do after that, and after there was very clear evidence of the dangers of ortho.
So the wave of cancer that Hooper predicted happened, and they had countless cases of bladder cancer. This was at a plant in Deepwater, New Jersey, where they made orthotoluidine, among other things. It was the primary place they made it, maybe the only place they made it. And Hooper was ousted because he was way too honest, and he was telling
He was doing his job.
He was doing his job, and that got him fired, ultimately. But the wave of cancer he predicted happened. And by the mid-1950s, DuPont was so wary of that chemical, wary of its own, it had already experienced this explosion of cancer in Deepwater, that it began outfitting its production workers in that era's version of moon suits, astronaut suits, helmet, and there are pictures of it. There are pictures of it in DuPont company, magazines. So they were protecting their own workers. They didn't want them to get one drop of that stuff on their skin because they knew it could be absorbed through the skin. Problem is they didn't tell any of their customers, including Goodyear, for another 20 years. So they knew and we know they knew because they were protecting their own workers. And then when they did finally write a letter to Goodyear and some of their other customers in 1977, it was a pretty weak warning. It was something along the lines of, well, there's evidence that this chemical can cause cancer in laboratory animals. You might want to protect your workers a little bit. Instead of just a red, blaring alarm, red flag, warning, whatever you do, don't allow anybody to get exposed to this stuff.
Right.
So that's what happened.
And it's very reminiscent of what's happened with climate change and the early work that Exxon and other companies were doing, knowing exactly what was happening with climate change very early on. It sounds like what the tobacco companies did. They knew the science behind lung cancer and tobacco, and they hit it. It seems to be yet another example of this.
Yes.
Would you put it in that kind of same category?
Yes, I would.
Yeah. So there's another Goodyear worker you talk about in the book named Gary Caston. And he tragically died of bladder cancer. And he told you a joke that Goodyear workers used to tell, which I use as the title for the event tonight, which is, "Don't worry, nothing here will hurt you." And this joke really jumped out at me as holding both the knowledge and the denial at the heart of the cancer cluster. Can you talk a bit about what it was like for some of these guys to get a job at one of these plants, and how they viewed the danger that they were walking into?
So a little bit of history. So during and right after World War II, Niagara Falls became this chemical manufacturing powerhouse. And I didn't know that until I started researching the book, and I don't think a lot of people realize just what a boomtown, industrial boomtown Niagara Falls was.
Driven by all the power, all the
cheap hydroelectric power.
Yeah.
So all the big companies were here: Union Carbide, DuPont, what am I missing? Occidental, et cetera. So all the big chemical companies were here during and immediately after the war. And the boom continued well into the 50s, into the 60s, and jobs were so plentiful that the saying was, if you got fired in the morning, you could find a new job that afternoon. And that probably was true, and the money was pretty good, especially with overtime. And, for people who maybe just came out of the service after World War II or had high school degrees, this was a really, really appealing industry to get into. And I don't know much about the other plants up here, but I know Goodyear it wasn't a sweatshop. It may not have always been pleasant, but it was not like working at a coal mine or some, hellish thing where you couldn't stand one more day of it. A lot of these guys stayed for decades. And so, and they weren't told about the hazards. So why would they worry about the hazards?
Right. Yeah, and that reminds me, there's this, you mentioned Lois Gibbs in this book. So a year and a half ago on this stage, I was interviewing Lois Gibbs about Love Canal. And her husband at the time, Harry Gibbs, was actually a worker at the Goodyear factory, which is, I had no idea of that. That was crazy to read. And there's this quote that the newspaper, so Love Canal, there's toxic waste buried under this neighborhood, and there was all this publicity, and Lois Gibbs was the main activist at the front of pushing back against this. And so the newspaper was interviewing Harry at the time, and here's what he said. He felt safer at Goodyear than in my own home. At least I was sure at Goodyear of the chemicals I was exposed to. And that really struck me, because this was happening at the same time as Love Canal, and there was all this national publicity about Love Canal and the school and the neighborhoods. But at the same time, workers right over the Goodyear factory were being exposed in similar ways, in a lot of measures, much worse. But it wasn't known about yet, or it wasn't known by the workers, at least, yet. And you really kind of unearth this simultaneous disaster, but it's taken so much more time to come to light. So how do you think about those two things that were happening at the same time, but really played very differently in the media?
Yeah, well, both happened in 1978. Love Canal was 1978. So in 1978, Goodyear would have just gotten this very weak warning letter from DuPont. I don't think there's any way the workers could have known in 1978 what was going on. So they were sort of blissfully unaware of what was happening to them. And the first bladder cancer case, I think, was Hank Shiro. It was. And that was, I want to say, mid-'80s. So there was no real reason for them, and then Love Canal was front page news for months and months and months, as you know. So there was just no way for them to know what was going on in their own plant.
Right.
And that's why Harry Gibbs said what he said.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wanted, we'll call orthotoluidide.
Just call it Ortho-T. That's what
we'll
they
call
do.
It Ortho-T. Just have trouble saying it. So Ortho-T was certainly not the only danger at Goodyear. And I wanted to take a minute to just kind of go through some of the stuff that you talk about in the book, about kind of some of the the context in which the workers were kind of coming into contact with these chemicals and the problems caused. So you talk a lot about Ray and Dottie, who were Diane's parents, Harry's parents-in-law. And so Diane was Ray and Dottie's first child, and she was born in 1958. 2 years later, in 1960, Ray started working at Goodyear in a department where he was exposed to vinyl chloride, which is another toxic chemical. In 1961, Ray and Dottie had their second child, Mark, who was seemingly healthy, but he died suddenly of spinal meningitis in 1963 at the age of 2. In 1964, Ray and Dottie had a third child, John, who was born without much of a brain or skull, and he died in less than a day. In 1965, Ray and Dottie had their fourth child, Donna, who was born with brain fluid buildup and a spinal cord defect. She died after 33 days. So vinyl chloride has been linked to birth defects, and Dottie was certainly exposed to vinyl chloride through what Ray brought home on his clothes and through the air, potentially even in the neighborhood. And these tragedies coming out of Goodyear are so intense that you document in the book. And this isn't the story of one chemical or one story. It's seeing these compounded horrors all coming out of this industry. And I was just wondering if you could talk about that bigger picture of what families were going through and how it fit in with all these other things coming at them.
Yeah, well, as I say in the book, the Goodyear plant was a two-headed beast in the early days. And the one side was vinyl, Department 145, where Ray worked for a while and would climb into these PVC reactors, these vessels that was encrusted with this white stuff that needed to be chipped away with a hammer and chisel. No protection at all. The guys would climb in there, I'm talking about in the early 60s, climb in there, very potent carcinogen, chip this stuff out, and the stuff was so strong that it would get them drunk. They would have to pull them out of there because they would get drunk. But they didn't know it was a carcinogen. So you had that side of the plant, and then you had the rubber chemicals side, which is where ortho-T was used. Another very potent carcinogen targeting a different organ, the bladder. And they were splashing this stuff all over themselves, going to work in T-shirts and jeans, no protective stuff. And I'm talking 60s, well into the 70s, into the 80s. Just oblivious. And the stuff stunk. It's a yellow liquid. It smelled. It stained their clothes, but they didn't see it as life-threatening because, again, nobody told them. And these sorts of things were going on, I don't know to this extent, I can't say that, but they were going on at chemical plants and refineries all over this country. Again, from that same post-war period to well into the 70s and 80s. They still are in some cases. I don't think it's quite as bad.
And what struck me is all this was happening before the bladder cancer even got going. It's like all these tragedies that were happening in this one family was just setting the stage for the bladder cancer to come, which is a bit hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, and Dottie felt certain. So the Klein, Mark, the Klein child who died of spinal meningitis, nobody thought that had anything to do with Ray's work. But John and Donna, who had the severe birth defects, Dottie certainly was convinced that they were related to Ray's work around vinyl chloride. And there were some studies done in the 70s, much later, suggesting that may well have been the case.
Right. So in the 1960s and 70s, labor unions were a powerful force in reporting health problems with workers and demanding that companies do more to protect them. However, when these workplace hazards were discovered, companies would often threaten to shut down a plant and move it overseas if unions pushed too hard, and often unions didn't push too hard for fear of losing jobs. How does this kind of mobility of capital and the ever-present threat of shutting down a plant factor into how chemicals are regulated or not regulated or put up with?
Well, first of all, it's almost always an empty threat.
Right.
Okay. I mean, I'm not saying it's never happened, but the union that represented the workers at Goodyear for many years until the union itself folded was the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers, OCAW. And they had a guy named Tony Mazzocchi, who was just a firebrand health and safety advocate. He cared only about protecting, because things in the 60s and 70s were just unbelievable what was going on in some of their plants, chemical plants and so forth. And he always said, and then his protege, Steve Wadka, who would later become the lawyer that represented a lot of the Goodyear guys, would say there's no job worth your life. And they would get these threats all the time. If you guys keep pushing, we're going to shut the plant down. And they would say, okay, do it. And it almost never happened. And they're the ones who got the feds, the federal health investigators, to come into this plant in Niagara Falls and do the painstaking research that proved that there was this massive elevation of cancer and tied it to this chemical, ortho-T.
Right. And talk a little bit more about Steve Wadka. He's this kind of has this wild story. He started in the Ivy League, and then he was in the fields with Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers, and then he made a film. Then he worked for the union, and then he became a lawyer. And he ended up representing all the bladder, or not all of them, but about half the bladder cancer cases coming out of Goodyear and other workers around the country. And you really credit him with being a key part of being able to write this book. Can you talk a little bit about him and kind of the importance of his role, not only in the book, but also the bigger picture of how this all played out?
Yeah, Steve had an almost a Forrest Gump existence. I mean, his life tracked all these key events from Cesar Chavez to Karen Silkwood, if anybody remembers the Karen Silkwood story. He was one of the people she was going to see the night she died in that very suspicious car wreck in 1974.
Later played by Meryl Streep.
Yes, and then turned into a movie, right. He was instrumental as a very young man, I mean, in his early 20s, as helping to craft the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. He was right there next to Tony Mazzocchi as I think he was 20 years old and considered some sort of a researcher or something. But he just jumped right into that fight and played a key role. And then he was working side by side with Tony throughout the 70s into the early 80s. And they would send Steve into the worst plants loaded with asbestos, like the plant in Tyler, Texas, that got a lot of press, or some of these refineries that were just loaded with benzene and other things. And Steve was like the troubleshooter. He would go into these plants, call OSHA in, demand, to see records, and he is incredibly persistent. He's also a real pain sometimes, but that's what made him such a great lawyer. And so he got his law degree in the mid-'80s. The union sort of didn't fall apart, but it lost a lot of its punch under Reagan.
Right.
And for
obvious
unsurprising reasons. So Steve said, it's time for me to do something else. So he got his law degree in the mid-'80s, started representing Goodyear workers and others. And it was said, including by people like Harry, that Steve knows more about that plant than any Goodyear, expert you could find.
Yeah.
He lived and breathed that plant from the mid-'80s until just a year or two ago when he retired.
And so would it be possible to write this book without all of that research he had done?
No, it would not.
Yeah. And that's an amazing kind of thing to think about journalism too, is you were in my class yesterday and you were saying this, that you need to find someone like that to get, because these companies, they're not going to tell you anything.
No, and even if you find somebody, Steve is really one of a kind. He's just, like I said earlier, has an encyclopedic memory, and he literally has an encyclopedia of documents, either on his computer or in his basement. He's got boxes of stuff going back to the 60s in his basement.
Right.
And he knows where it all is. I have no idea how.
So let's talk for a minute about OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So it was created in 1971, and you have this really great quotation in the book from Richard Nixon, who talks about how the public pays attention to big, dramatic disasters, but not slow-moving, hard-to-see ones that play out over time. This was Richard Nixon saying this before he created OSHA. So think about that. But sometimes, these diseases, they sometimes take decades to develop. Can you talk a bit about this idea of latency periods and how do latency periods make it really hard to fight for reforms, really easy for companies to evade responsibility, and maybe how this extended timescale makes it hard to report about these stories?
Yeah, as you say, and as Nixon himself said, if a plant blows up and kills a bunch of workers, it'll make front page news in the nightly news. And, it's such an obvious thing that it gets media coverage. But the folks in the chemical industry and the oil refining industry and some of these other high hazard industries get exposed to these chemicals, and latency period means, the amount of time it takes from initial exposure until the disease presents itself. And in many cases, that can be 20, 30, or even 40 years. So you've got somebody who starts as a 21-year-old at a plant, name doesn't matter. And let's say he's exposed to benzene, which is another very strong carcinogen. And he works there for 40 years, and he gets leukemia, which is the disease benzene is tied to, at 61. Maybe he's retired by then. The company, regardless of how strong the evidence is, the company's probably going to say, wasn't us. Maybe he smoked. Maybe it inherited from his parents.
Yeah, you talk about in the book some of the questioning that the workers would get. It's just like harassment.
It's the anything but my product defense. So they would bring these workers in, including folks like Harry, for depositions. And they were all suing DuPont, which was the main manufacturer of the chemical. They weren't suing Goodyear. So they'd bring them in and go through their work histories, and then they'd start chipping away at them. Well, exactly how many times were you exposed to orthotoluidine? Well, I don't know. Well, estimate 100, 5,000, and then they'd say, have you ever smoked? Have you ever had drunk alcohol? What was your parents' health like? And they would literally try to find anything other than the obvious, other than the elephant in the room. They would try to find anything to pin the person's cancer on.
Right.
And you read some of this stuff and you almost laugh because it's so ridiculous.
Yeah.
And by this time they knew that the chemical was causing bladder cancer.
Right. And they were still doing this.
Yeah.
Yeah. It takes a special kind of person to do that.
It does.
And you mentioned that Steve Wodka was suing DuPont in all of these cases, not Goodyear. Can you explain that a little bit? So everybody worked at Goodyear and they got the exposures at Goodyear, and then DuPont was sued. Talk us through that.
Well, to put it as simply as I can, the workers' comp law says you can't sue your employer for something like an industrial disease. You can file a comp claim and try to get medical benefits, so forth, but you can't sue them. So what you have to do in a situation like this, and in many others, sue a third party. And so in this case, it would be the chemical suppliers, DuPont, and a couple of others, but mainly DuPont. So if you wanted to get a substantial settlement or jury verdict, that's who you would take to court.
Right. And what is your sense of culpability between DuPont and Goodyear? How do you think about that? Who do you get angrier at about what they did and how they did it?
Well, it's hard not to blame DuPont first because of what I said earlier, that they were protecting their own employees against the same chemical in the mid-1950s and didn't bother to tell their customers for at least 20 years. On the other hand, once Goodyear saw what was happening, it could have moved a lot quicker. And it sort of dragged its feet into the early 90s and finally started to protect the workers and install engineering controls and so forth.
Right.
So, I mean, the short answer is both, I think, are culpable.
Yeah. And you talk a bunch in the book about kind of the regulations in terms of what workers can be exposed to. And there's a limit of 5 parts per million for ortho T.
In the air.
In the air. And it used to be a lot higher, and a lot of people wanted it to get a lot lower, but it got to 5. But tell me about what's the problem with just measuring the amount in the air when you've got a chemical that can be exposed through the skin?
First of all, the limit in the air of 5 parts per million has not changed since 1970. So OSHA never lowered it. It's been that way since before the agency started. The problem with that is, as I mentioned earlier, the big exposure risk is through the skin, is absorption. And there is no standard for that, even though there was science going back much before 1970 suggesting this was an exposure hazard. And so what would happen is, OSHA would go in and take measurements in the Goodyear plant in the air, and it would be well below 5 parts per million.
And they could say we're not breaking the law.
And the company could say, well, they technically were not breaking the law. But there was no limit for how much these guys could absorb through their skin. So it was a fundamentally flawed system. Right. And it still is. It's the same way right now. It hasn't changed.
So you spend some time in the book on Eula Bigham, who Carter put in charge of OSHA. And you write about how you thought she was probably the most effective administrator of OSHA, exemplified by her hard-fought benzene standard in 1978. But her efforts were largely stopped by the courts in many cases, and a lawsuit over the benzene standard itself actually led to a Supreme Court ruling that inscribed into law a second-tier status with respect to health protections for workers. Can you talk a little bit about Eula and the kind of the flip side of her doing her job well under Carter?
Yeah, Eula Bigham was a scientist from rural Kentucky who was teaching and doing research at the University of Cincinnati. And was pretty well known in the labor movement, but never saw herself as a Washington type. And somehow she got on Jimmy Carter's radar. And he sort of forced her to take the OSHA job. And I had the pleasure of meeting Eula in Cincinnati about 10 years ago, long after she'd retired. And she told the story. She didn't want to do it. She was happy being a researcher, and she was looking into these toxic chemicals. And Carter basically twisted her arm and said, we need you got to do it. She's the first woman to head OSHA. So she took it, and she went to Washington in 1977 and basically raised hell, but did it in a very clever way. She was real folksy. She could go out and drink beer with union people or industry people. You know, she was not your standard scientist, but she was incredibly smart and driven. You just couldn't quite see it. And so industry didn't know what hit them. They thought, oh, who's this nice little lady, you know? And she basically tore them a new one, you know? And she just started going after the worst chemicals, benzene, lead, cotton dust was a really big deal, brown lung. And she started knocking them out. They would knock out these standards, and the industry people were just blown away. They didn't see it coming. So that led to court cases like the benzene case that the American Petroleum Institute filed and stalled that standard for 7 years.
Right.
You know, but she made more progress against these chemicals than anybody before her or after her. And had Carter not lost to Reagan in 1980, and had she stayed in that job another 4 years, which people think she would have, who knows what, she might have been able to change the whole culture of regulating chemicals.
And how much did the courts get in the way? And can you talk specifically about this Supreme Court decision that really inscribes some not very good things into law?
Yeah, the Supreme Court basically said you have to prove, the government, OSHA, have to show that there is significant risk before you can regulate a chemical like benzene. And they defined significant risk as like 1 in 1,000 chance of getting cancer. And I don't know, it's kind of complicated, but they set a high bar for setting stricter standards for chemicals like benzene. And eventually they got the standard they wanted, but it was delayed for, I want to say 7 years, maybe longer.
Right.
And so during that whole period, these workers are still being exposed to the higher levels that OSHA knew were too high and were causing leukemia.
Right. And you write that OSHA has set exposure limits for fewer than 1% of the chemicals ever made or used in the United States, and that most of these limits aren't protective. And in the US, the burden of proof is on EPA or on individuals to show that a chemical is dangerous rather than the burden of proof being on the companies to show that it's safe. We take this substance by substance approach to chemical regulation instead of regulating chemicals with similar characteristics in groups. So how, from all this investigation you've done with this, do you see ways that this can start to change?
Well, they're already doing it in Europe. They're doing it, they're not perfect, but they're doing it differently, and that is they're presuming a chemical is guilty, and you, the company, the manufacturer, have to show it's innocent. Here, it's the reverse. companies are allowed to put these chemicals on the market, and then we, the public, have to somehow prove that it's dangerous before they'll even consider restricting it. Things are a little bit better now than they were a few years ago, thanks to some legislation. But, I mean, it basically would take political will. Somebody would have to decide, we're going to adopt the European system of regulating chemicals. And I'm afraid I don't see that happening anytime soon.
And what do you see? I mean, there are kind of the obvious political differences with Europe, but do you see other things that are in the way of that kind of progress being made in the United States?
Yeah, the companies don't want to do it, don't want to do things they aren't forced to do, and they've got plenty of friends on Capitol Hill who will stand by them and not make them do it. The irony, of course, is, take DuPont, has a plant in, I don't know, France, and a plant in Texas, and makes the same stuff, let's say, but they have to abide by different rules in France, and they know it, so they do it. They abide by it, and they somehow manage to still make money.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
But they don't want to. They don't want to do it here.
We'll go out of business if you make us do this.
Yeah.
And then guess what? They don't go out of business.
That's right. That's why I said it's often an empty threat about putting them out of business.
So you tell this really interesting story in the book about one of OSHA's really great success stories. In 1974, there was another cancer cluster. 4 PVC workers at the BF Goodrich plant in Louisiana developed angiosarcoma of the liver, which is extremely rare. And on average, there are about 25 cases in the United States each year. And 4 of these were in one plant in Louisiana. Can you talk about how this angiosarcoma cancer cluster led to this kind of rare instance of decisive action from OSHA and why that doesn't happen more? Why can't that happen more often?
Yeah, the plant was actually in Louisville, not Louisiana.
Oh, it was Louisville.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. But in 1974, they found these 4 cases of very, very rare liver cancer, angiosarcoma. And OSHA stepped in, and within, I know in less than a year, I want to say maybe 8 months, had an emergency rule in place. It was front page news, and then they kept finding more and more cases. They have never acted that quickly before, and they haven't since. And I don't know exactly why that was. The agency was still pretty young back then. But it's just almost impossible for them to move very quickly against even a very dangerous chemical today.
Why is that? What has changed?
Politics, lawsuits, like the benzene case. Anytime they try to tighten a standard, they're going to get sued by industry.
Right. Yeah. So why do we need Ortho-T? Like, what is it used for? Are there replacements for it? Do we need to be dealing in such a toxic chemical?
I don't know if there are replacements for it, but Goodyear uses it to make a product called Nalax, which is a tire antioxidant. It's an additive to tires to keep them from cracking in extreme heat or cold. And after it comes through the process up here at the plant in Niagara Falls, it comes out looking like chocolate chips. It's a solid, and they bag it and they ship it to the tire plants all over the country. So whether there is a safer alternative, I don't know, and that's a very good question. And
it's no longer made in the United States at all.
Correct.
It all comes from China and India now.
It's imported, yes.
So talk a little bit about that. You've got much weaker environmental regulations in India and China. So these companies, rather than stop using something or changing their practices, they're now just shipping that process, but also that disease. We know that people in those countries are going to be going through this too, but maybe not with the open press and the same rights that we have here. I'm almost certain that workers in those countries are getting or will get bladder cancer for the reason you just said. I mean, this stuff was so bad and DuPont got so tired of being sued that they stopped making it years ago. I want to say in the 90s. 95 is my memory.
Mid-90s. So even DuPont had enough of it.
Right, which is saying something. But Goodyear, as of a couple of years ago, was still importing, I want to say, 2.5 million pounds a year. So
They see it as some kind of a irreplaceable product, whether it is or not, I don't know.
Right, right. So DuPont, we know also from their great work with PFAS. There's been movies like Dark Waters made about their adventures in PFAS. And a lot of publicity, huge $10 million plus fine from the EPA. How do you see what's happened here with Ortho-T and what happened with PFAS and their kind of role in covering up the science?
It's a very similar story. They knew, DuPont knew, and again, we know they knew because they were, putting their workers in moon suits in the 1950s. Maybe not because they were great human beings, but because they wanted to, protect the bottom line and not lose a bunch of workers. So I think it's a very similar story. It's just not as well known, not nearly as well known.
Right. It seems that protecting workers from a chemical that you just, like what DuPont's doing, you put your workers in moon suits and it doesn't touch their skin. It doesn't seem that expensive. Like why would these companies learn these things and not take relatively simple steps? Is it just that there's this whole facade that they're always right and they're never wrong and they never bow to pressure, they never give in, they never lose a penny if they don't have to? What is it?
I mean, it's hard for me to get inside their heads. I don't know that I would want to, but I think it's that. I mean, their corporate medical director, Clifford Johnson, this must have been in the 1980s. There's an anecdote in the book about him attending a union meeting with a bunch of the union guys here in Niagara Falls to try to calm them down, right, as this cancer epidemic was unfolding. He said, look, guys, this is the corporate medical director, not the corporate PR director or the CEO. He said, look, guys, there's really nothing to worry about here. And in fact, you have a higher risk of getting bladder cancer from eating grilled meat than you do from the chemicals in this plant.
Wow.
So if you've got your corporate medical director, telling whoppers like that, what does that say about the company culture?
Wow. And did you get to talk to the company at all?
Nope.
Have you ever had an opportunity to engage with anybody who is in some kind of position of power or responsibility?
No, I got written statements from both DuPont and Goodyear, and I forget, one was very terse, and I forget which was which, it's in the book, but no, I mean, they didn't want to. I gave them many opportunities to talk to me. I said, I'll talk to anybody at your corporate office or the plant manager, and no, we'll be giving you a statement, and that's what they did. That's what they do these days anyway.
Yeah, that's what their lawyers tell them to do.
Yep.
And they're right.
Yep, because they can control the message that way.
Right. So you just published a new article last week, right here in WBFO, the NPR affiliate here in Buffalo. And so some new Department of Environmental Conservation documents have come to light that show for the past 15 years, Goodyear has been emitting Ortho-T into the air in Niagara Falls at levels 1,000% higher than what regulators have set as a limit. There are documented cases already of bladder cancer in the neighborhood immediately east of the plant. And when you asked the Department of Environmental Conservation whether they've even notified the community of elevated emissions, they didn't respond to you. This is not DuPont or Goodyear. This is the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. What's going on here? And is Goodyear now reducing exposures for their workers by spewing these chemicals into the air in Niagara Falls for everybody to breathe?
I mean, it would be speculation, but it appears that, yes, as they've started controlling exposures inside the plant, one way to do that is to shoot it up out of the stacks, which I suppose is good for the workers, but probably not so great for
not for their families.
The neighbors. They have some pollution control equipment that is just not working, and not working the way it should. It is not capturing Ortho-T and another chemical. that's probably not quite as dangerous as ortho T. And the state has known about it for years. And when I asked him about it, I said, well, are you going to make them stop? It seems like a reasonable question. Well, we're still investigating. Yes, we're working on a solution. Well, when? 10 years from now? And Niagara County, my reporting partner, Emily Watkins with WBFO, found out has one of the highest bladder cancer rates in the country.
Wow.
And I think the second highest in New York State.
Yeah.
So there's already, and this is among the general population, we're not talking about workers here.
Right.
So there's already an elevated rate of bladder cancer in that county.
Yeah, and you live in Texas. I lived in Texas for 18 years. We expect this kind of behavior from Texas. They advertise it.
We do.
But this is New York. Why is the government here not protecting workers, not protecting the public in a way that, I don't know, would maybe align with what we would expect?
Well, I don't know as much about New York politics as I do about Texas politics, but wasn't Cuomo a big pro-business guy?
True.
We're open for business, that sort of thing. And so, which is the problem in Texas, as you well know. So, in their lust to attract more businesses or keep more businesses, apparently they're willing to overlook public health threats like this. I don't know. I really don't know why they haven't moved more aggressively.
Yeah. So I want to read a little bit from near the end of the book, which I think sums up where we are right now in a really really great way. You write, even when a chemical has been studied to the nth degree and its victims can be counted and named, OSHA won't or can't respond. The standard for ortho T remains at 5 parts per million, based on research last conducted in 1963. Research that didn't consider the chemical's potential carcinogenicity. It took an improbable confluence of events, unrelenting pressure on the company from a strong union, an airtight health investigation by the federal government, even to uncover the bladder cancer epidemic at Goodyear and Niagara Falls, let alone address it. In 1983, about 20% of all workers in the United States belonged to a union. Only 10% belonged in 2022. If a cancer cluster like the one at Goodyear were percolating at a factory or dozens of factories at this moment, it might never be found. So at the end of the book, you also describe the kind of widening dangers of all kinds of chemical and material exposures that today's workers are suffering, including solvents, silica, nanomaterials. What do you think needs to happen for our companies, our government, our culture to care about the health of workers and to take proactive, preventative steps to assure the safety of workers, the public, and the environment that are all under this constant threat from industrial chemicals?
Well, there's no one thing. The one obvious thing is from its birth, OSHA has been starved of resources. So for the last 54 years, it's ebbed and flowed, and under usually Democratic administrations, its budget will go up marginally, and then Republican will go down and up, down, up, down. But it has never been where it needs to be. And as I like to say, we spend on worker safety in this country, we spend about $3.99 per worker, which is less than a Starbucks venti latte would cost you. Seriously. And that gives you a sense of the level of commitment or lack of commitment we have to protecting the men and women who do the hardest jobs in this country. So, and then fewer and fewer people belong to unions. So who knows, we did Public Health Watch did a story almost 2 years ago now, broke a story about a cluster of a horrible lung disease called silicosis in the Los Angeles area. And what's going on is these are young immigrant workers, mostly from Mexico, Central America. They're working in these little garage-sized shops And what they're doing is cutting artificial stone countertops that most of us have in our homes, probably.
Right.
Fake stone that looks like natural stone.
Buy it at Home Depot and Lowe's.
Yeah, you can buy it at Home Depot, Lowe's, furniture, home showrooms, all that stuff. And we've all seen them. We all probably have them, or many of us do. And when you cut that stuff, which is loaded with silica, it turns into a fine white powder, and I compare it to powdered sugar, that consistency. And if you're not protecting yourself, which most of these guys aren't, maybe they have a bandana around their mouth, which doesn't do anything, it goes right into your lungs. And it sits there and it starts causing scarring. And once the exposure reaches a certain level, you're cooked. It's fatal. There is no cure. The best thing you can hope for is a double lung transplant, which is not something to hope for.
No.
It can cost $1 million, and it prolongs your life maybe 10 years, maybe. And so we did this story and showed that this was another epidemic of a disease that is literally an ancient disease. It goes back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. We're getting the same disease millennia
Say we're cutting
ago.
stone way back then?
Cutting stone, mining, all the things that the ancient workers did. And here we are in 2024, and now this thing has exploded. Last I heard, there were 172 cases, mostly in Southern California, but in California. And of course, that's an undercount because there's no way they can. None of these guys are unionized. And because they're immigrant workers, many don't speak any English, they're not going to complain. Who are they going to complain to?
Right.
And the only way we found out about that story was through a very courageous doctor at one of the UCLA medical centers out there, who, at some risk to herself, decided to go on the record because she was seeing these guys. She was treating a lot of these guys. And she was just outraged. And so she agreed to be interviewed by us and a couple of our partners, media partners.
Wow. Yeah,
But,
it's like Steve Wadka. You need that inside person who knows stuff that nobody else knows.
Right, but what if she hadn't gone public? Though?
Right.
It's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
And again, this is still happening. So.
Well, and this is in contrast, you talk about in the book, kind of the company doctors and the company people, and their job is to make sure the company's never blamed for anything.
Yeah.
And so when you find these people, a lawyer and a doctor who will put themselves on the line, it's really remarkable. But unfortunately, it has to be remarkable. It's not easy to do.
I'm pretty sure that if she had been at University of Texas instead of UCLA, she never would have gone on record because her job would have been at risk.
Right.
You just don't do that in Texas.
Right. Yeah. Well, you mentioned a couple times, you could kind of give this sense in the book of this idea that we have sometimes that these are problems of the past. Like, oh, it used to be bad. It used to be real rough and dirty in the plants, but it's all good now. We've learned our lesson. There are better regulations now. But you have all these examples over and over and over again. That is not true at all.
No.
Like the problems change when you can put a name for a problem and force a company to change it. Yes, they're going to make that one thing better. But then there's this thing over here and this new chemical, and there are always new chemicals coming in and there are new processes. And it's just this constant barrage of dangers. And it hasn't gotten better in many ways. How do you view that? And how do you think about how do you communicate that to the public?
Well, it is certainly not as bad as it was 50 years ago, but that's a low bar.
Yeah.
Because what was happening 50 years ago was just beyond the pale. And if you read the book, you'll see some of the stories from the late 60s. We're not talking about ancient times here. We're talking about late 60s and some of the stuff that these workers had to put up with. Just unbelievable, like something out of a horror story. So it is not as bad looking at the big picture. But then, as you say, these things keep popping up, like the silicosis cluster in California that I talked about a minute ago. And I don't know. And then we've got new products like these nanomaterials that are ubiquitous now, that are everywhere, that early research is showing, and again, early research, I don't mean to say this is settled, shows that these materials can behave like asbestos.
Right.
That's not great.
No.
Asbestos, we know about asbestos.
Yes.
So
Been there before. We've seen this movie.
Yeah, it's just this lack of commitment to blue collar workers in particular. And what really irritates me is, especially in the political seasons, right? Oh, we care about our blue collar workers, our men and women who work in factories, put the stupid looking hard hat on. And no, we don't care. We don't care because if we cared, we would invest a lot more money and a lot more resources into protecting them.
And not be afraid to put limitations and regulations on companies.
Yes, and bring, and this is almost never done, and bring criminal cases, and especially there have been a few, but when there are fatalities, when a worker is killed on the job, and there's evidence of extreme neglect and that there's willful neglect, technically, the Department of Justice can bring criminal cases. Almost never happens. But it could. You think putting a few of these people in jail might get their attention? I think it might.
Yeah. Enron.
What's that?
Enron.
Yeah.
Yep, it can happen. So I also want to read another paragraph from the very end of the book. But before I do that, I was wondering if you could just set up what happened with Ray Klein at the end. He had he was on a pension, but then he had to start working again. Can you kind of talk us through kind of like what he went through?
Well, both Ray and Harry had their health benefits slashed. I think Ray, to your question, Ray was working partly out of necessity, but probably partly to stay busy. Ray is not an idle guy. He's a sort of guy that needs to be active and so forth. So here's a man in his mid-80s having to work and making $13 an hour a few years ago while fighting off bladder cancer or worrying about the next round of bladder cancer coming and other health issues.
Right. Well, here's the paragraph that kind of puts this into context. Goodyear shows no sign of ending its use of the chemical Ortho-T. In 2021, the Niagara Falls plant received 2.56 million pounds from manufacturers in India and China. The same year, Goodyear reported net sales of $17.5 billion, a 42% increase over 2020, a bump mainly due to their merger with Cooper Tire. It employed some 72,000 people in 57 sites in 23 countries. Its chairman, president, and CEO, Richard Kramer, received $21.4 million in total compensation. Ray Klein, octogenarian, bladder cancer survivor, and loyal Goodyear employee for 39 years, made $13 an hour delivering auto parts. That really...
it's an interesting contrast.
Yeah, that really paints the picture. And, these constant, we have to cut pension benefits. Look at those numbers.
Yes, that was why
They're insane.
I wanted to point that out, that the CEO made $21 million that year.
Yeah, and the profits. I mean, it's just do you have any,
Yeah, it's...
insight?
I thought that would be a good way to end the book.
It is. Well, looking back at this point in your life, do you see the air you breathe, the environment you live in, do you see it differently than you did when you were growing up in Orange, Texas?
Oh, yeah.
In what way? What's kind of changed for you?
Well, I think the big thing for me was working in Houston for 9 years. And I spent a lot of time in these really nasty industrial areas, refineries, chemical plants, places like Texas City, Texas, and Baytown, Texas, and you name it. You've been to some of those places, I know. And just seeing the impacts on the workers, seeing all this cancer and other illnesses, asbestosis, mesothelioma, and then seeing what the people who live near these plants have had to put up with and are still putting up with. And in fact, in many ways, it's much worse now than it was in the 90s when I was in Houston, because this petrochemical industry has just gone crazy down there. And much of it is not to make more gasoline or petroleum products. It's to feed the plastics boom, which is really the last thing we need, right? To be making more plastics. But you see parts of the Texas coast that were once pretty much rural, unspoiled, maybe not pristine, but unspoiled. I'm talking about down near Corpus Christi, for example. They've got these massive plants they call ethane crackers. Exxon opened one down in San Patricio County 4 years ago. It's these monstrous plants that churn out all this stuff that goes toward the manufacturing of plastics.
Right. And then LNG too.
Yeah, and then LNG, which is all exported to Europe or wherever. So I don't know, but when a state sends the message that Texas has sent, and maybe New York is sending now, I don't know, that we just want the money. We're not going to bother you. You can pollute. You can make your workers sick, and if the press annoys us too much, we might slap you on the wrist with a $50,000 fine. But that's pocket change for these companies.
Right.
So it is. But those years in Houston really, again, opened my eyes to what goes on in these plants.
Yeah. So I've asked you to bring a quotation to read that's been particularly meaningful to you in your kind of journey in life. Could you read what you brought and tell us?
I'll have to borrow it from you.
It's highlighted.
Hang on, let me put my glasses on. It's very short. So yeah, this is just a very short quote from Ernest Hemingway. I'm a big Hemingway fanatic. And he said, "As a writer, you should not judge, you should understand." And that is what I hope I've done with this book. I had one of your students yesterday ask me, how did you keep from making everybody seem like a victim in the book, or something like that? I said, well, first of all, people with bladder cancer are victims. Let's put that on the table. The term is overused, but if you're a bladder cancer patient, if you develop bladder cancer because of something your employer did to you, that is the definition of a victim. But I made sure to put in the book stories from people like Ray Klein, who talked about, what a good living they made at the plant and how well treated they were, and how proud they were that they were able to raise families and put kids through college and so forth. And I tried to balance that out a little bit. So whether I judged or not, I guess, leave that to the reader. But
well, after you with this quote, it makes me think, like, after you understand, when is it appropriate to judge, and who do you think should be judging?
You present the facts and you let the reader judge. And I think the readers of this book will come to their own conclusions, and I think most of them will decide that what happened was wrong and was completely preventable.
Yes. Well, Jim, thank you so much for writing this book.
Thank you.
For being here today.
Thank you.
And for spending so much time and energy and writing beautifully about something that's really, really difficult. All right. So Harry, you want to come on up to stage, and you can kind of take my spot. Does anybody have questions? You want to jump in?
I can tell you another thing real quick. This is Goodyear's attitude, and this is how it was there. It was this, and they would get very irritated because people would say it. It was always safety first, unless it interferes with production. It depends what was going on. I had this cancer, and I worked in the maintenance shop. So we'd get a leak on one of these pumps. My guys would say, the guys I work with, great guys do, they'd be like, Harry, you already got it, my man. I don't got it. You already got the ginch. You go pull the pump. And so, that's what I would do. And Goodyear has the attitude now that, well, that was just like you were saying, that's from the past. That is. But I'm going to tell you right now, as I'm sitting here, it's going to be a lot more people end up getting this bladder cancer, And you know, me personally speaking, I'm like this. You know what? I don't have time to die. I'm too busy right now. I'll die some other time. And that's my attitude.
That's the way to do it. Sorry, in the back, you have a question?
Once you found out about your cancer, what made you keep going back to Goodyear and working? What made you not want to quit?
I had worked there. I made really good money. Make no mistake about it. I worked in the maintenance department, and I worked a lot of hours. I would tell you how many hours I work, and you'd be like, bullshit. No, but Ray would tell you I worked a lot of hours. But so we made good money. That's one of the problems they have in a place like that. You make so much money that you know, it's a trade-off. You're in there all the time. But people don't want to let go of the money. But my thing was always, I wanted to work. I was just going to work till I was 55, retire, and spend the rest of my life with my wife. And I got to spend 10 great years with her. I retired, and this is how I retired. I walked into Goodyear and said, hey, they're like, what? I said, I'm going to retire. They're like, what? When? I said, tomorrow. They're like, tomorrow? You can't retire tomorrow. I said, I can, and I am. They said, well, your pension will be delayed. You'll get it. I said, I don't care. And then they said, you know what? Diane's got to sign the papers for you to retire. Give me the phone. Hey, Di, we had already talked too. I said, hey, I'm going to retire. I said, but you got to sign the papers. She said, I'll be there in 20 minutes. And I went in, she signed the papers. I went back to the maintenance shop. Guys, it's been great. See you later. And I'm so glad I did because my wife passed away 10 years later, you know, so.
Do you have a question?
Thank you so much for the story. It's been really great. I was wondering if you were planning on doing an audiobook version.
I believe there is an audiobook. I actually haven't heard it, but Harry says there is.
It is. I've had some friends that buy it. They said it's very good.
I should have had Harry narrate it.
Yes. Yeah. Have to edit out a lot.
Well, yeah. I don't know if any of you got the book, but when I was young, I was a tad bit on the wild side. And Jim I was reading it, I'm like, wow, I can't believe you put that in the book. And he's like, oh, it gives the book flavor, Harry. I'm like,
Well, it was true, wasn't it?
yeah, it's the old stop me when I'm lying. You know?
And the book is available back there, by the way.
Yeah, Burning Books. Burning Books is here. Local bookstore. Support local bookstores. Was there another question, Amy?
So it seems like the union at Dunlop is a lot weaker now. Do you worry for the workers that are still there without a strong union to back them?
You know that I have to really select my words wisely on that. You know, I was in the OCAW. I started in 1977. Our union was strong, just like you alluded to, Jim. It was very strong. And then we had a couple mergers. We merged with Pace, and we were still strong. And then we merged with the United Steelworkers. And the only thing I'll say, this is the nicest way I can say it, they have a different, a different philosophy, you know, a different program, you know, than what I seen with the OCAW, you know. So and I know Goodyear's really irritated about this book. You know, I know DuPont. They were probably listening to this podcast, I'm sure. And, you know, they spent a lot of money. Like with my case, I was case number 37, and I was the first guy out of them 36 people ahead of me that smoked. And here's how it would go. It would, just like you said, Chip. You smoke, yeah. Well, you know, you smoke, you could have got bladder cancer, you know. And they would beat these guys up, and like you said, they would just throw everything in there, you know. And then I came along, And we had a really good lawyer in Steve Waka. And he said, Hare, he said, this is how it usually goes. We file this thing, you know, we go through the deposition stuff. He said, usually takes 2 years to settle it. He said, I get a third plus expenses. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but I did. But he worked so hard. My case went on for damn near 10 years. And it was ugly and it was contentious. So, and I know that somebody, I got a call from somebody, I'm not going to say his name, but, and said, guess what, Hare? The DuPont fired their corporate lawyer today. And I'm like, what? Why? He said, you. He said, they spent so much money on your case. And here's the thing, you know, I can never tell you how much money I got, you know. You got to sign all them things. But trust me when I tell you, you know, I'm not sitting here driving 3 cars and, you know, got a manservant or nothing like that. and you
Is
know,
that the first thing you would get if you could?
Yeah. So, but Steve worked hard. Steve is oh my gosh, he is such a good lawyer, you know. And he does not work for the union anymore. They have let him go, if you can believe that, which, in my opinion, I know this guy. That's a big, colossal mistake. He knew more about the factory. I worked there 34 years. He knew more about the factory than I did.
And it's scary to think moving forward, you know, you can't produce people like that easily, you know, with that background, with those skills. You know, who's gonna pick up the mantle? And
he is. He's a very modest man. You know, I knew who he was, and when he took my case one day, and he prepared me really well. He's really a sharp guy. One day I said, you know what? I'm going to look Steve up on the computer. You know, I'm going to Google him, see what he's all about. And the first thing I come up with that Karen Silkwood. I don't know how many people you know. If you're familiar with it, she was a woman that worked in Oklahoma for a company called Kara McGee. And they were making nuclear fuel rods, and they were leaking plutonium, and the company was having them fudge the numbers. And all these people were getting exposed. So she blew them in, and she was on her way to meet a reporter at a restaurant, a reporter and a lawyer, and she never made it there. Somebody run her car off the road and killed her, and they never did find out who did it, right?
No, and Steve was the lawyer she was going
And
to meet.
Steve was the lawyer. I'm like, damn, Steve, you never told me that. He's like, oh, yeah. He says.
And this accident, all the papers she was taking to this meeting were gone.
Mysteriously disappeared.
Mysteriously flew out the window into the river.
Yeah, they just disappeared, you know. Yeah, Steve's pretty sharp, you know.
Sarah, do you have a question?
I want to ask about the future, maybe Jim and John. We're real older, and we have a younger generation now, 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds. In one hand, they're saying they eat clean food, everything's pure, there's no chemicals, blah, blah, blah. And that's kind of scratching the surface. I'm interested in both of your personal, very, very personal story that got you to be activists in the ways that you are. Because I've always thought that a person's story moves them more than the politics that leads them. But it's some kind of personal story. I was just curious how both of you would talk about how you became activists and maybe looking towards the future.
Yeah, I don't think I would call myself an activist.
Concerned about the world and not trying to make as much money as you can.
I thought you would say that, so
Yeah, you knew I would say that, yeah.
that's true with a lot of people who work
I'm happy when my work inspires activists, advocates, lawyers, you know, but I don't consider myself an activist. I just think, as I said earlier, my work in Houston, and I would go see these guys with cancer at 55, and even more important, get to know their families, and just understand the sense of betrayal, and I'm sure Harry can relate to this. It's like, you did what to me? You know, I've given you 30 years, and yes, a lot of these folks make really good money, like Harry said, but just the sense of betrayal just made me really angry. And you'd talk to the wives and the grown children, and you know, maybe the worker was already dead or was very close to death, and they were just speechless that the company would have let this happen to them. And then as a sort of a final indignity, you know, sort of similar to cutting your health benefits, I remember a number of wives of widows telling me, and I never heard from the company again. They didn't even send flowers to the funeral. And it just sent home the message that, yeah, we were happy to have your labor for 30 years or 40 years, but once you're gone, you know, you're not our problem anymore. That's what motivates me, is what I saw in Houston in particular.
Yeah, so a couple things. First, I would say, related to this, I hear a lot of young people now when they talk about what they're going to do with their lives and their anxieties, which are understandable. I'm shocked by how many people, you know, particularly in the kind of a college world, they just, you know, want to be in business or make a lot of money or be an influencer or something like that. And I feel, at least in this kind of university world, I feel like there's so much less of what I saw when I was young, of like, I believe in this thing and I wanted to help change the world in this way. And I don't see that as much. I do see it. I mean, I'm lucky to teach these environmental classes. A lot of my students are here and they're great, but I feel like it's kind of unique. And I worry about that. I also listen to the presidential, debates and like how people are going to vote. And it's just like the economy is everything right now. And we are the richest country in the world. We are the richest culture in human history. We have more stuff. We have more access to amazing food. We have more access to life-saving medicines than any other people ever to walk the planet. And still, we're just obsessed constantly. How can I make more money? How can, you know, and that worries me. That's not about me, of course. But I just wanted, your question made me think of that, is where are Steve Wadkas to jump in the future? I hope they come. I hope they're there, and I'm just not seeing it right now. But partially it's like society's changed so much. It's hard. You know, it's really hard to make a living doing much of anything. But anyway, for me personally, you know, my mom was just a very, she cared about people and social issues in the world, and I think that soaked into me a lot. And then, you know, I was always, you know, super engaged in environmental issues and human rights issues and social justice stuff. And then I moved to Texas after grad school and, you know, jumped into various film projects, and my wife's an organizer, and I saw, you know, she worked with immigrants a lot, and then, you know, death penalty cases and that kind of thing. And I've been in lots of people's houses who have like holes in the floor. And it's super important to be exposed to kind of the unbelievably wide variety of experiences that people have in this country. And I feel very lucky that I was able to be exposed to a lot of that. And it really gets deep inside of you in terms of like, you know, like, yes, I need a job. Yes, I need to make money so I can do this work, but it needs to all be going towards something that's bigger than me, that's bigger than comfort, that's bigger than status, you know, whatever might attract us.
Rage is a good motivator too.
Or you could just be pissed off.
What's that?
Or you could just be pissed off, yeah.
Which I am most of the time. Yes. And I'm 67 years old, and I'm not going to change. But it is a motivator. And when you hear stories like Goodyear or many others that I've done, it just irritates you as a human being, just the arrogance and the dismissiveness and so forth. So that's a motivator too. And I hope the younger generation has some of that, because you got to have it.
Yep. Any last questions? Yes.
I was wondering, perhaps to Jim, this goes, so were you ever concerned about your own safety in terms of the research that you were conducting, or maybe afraid that workers would be retaliated against because they were talking to you, or how did you navigate these concerns about, these companies are very powerful, and, when conducting research, sometimes you might find obstacles and challenges and even attacks. So how did you think about this?
I never felt concerned for my physical safety, but there was an incident in Houston in 1998 when I was working on the vinyl chloride series. It started in June of that year with the first 3 or 4 big stories about how the PVC industry had lied about vinyl chloride, the same scenario that we saw here at Goodyear. And after those first few stories came out, a bunch of guys in suits came to the newsroom from Washington, and they were with the American Chemistry Council, which is used to be the Chemical Manufacturers Association. And when you see guys in suits, that's bad, generally. And they had demanded a meeting with the top editors. I was not invited, of course, but I heard about it. And they came in and said, what is this guy doing? Because the chemical industry is a sacred cow in Houston. It's worth billions and billions of dollars, a big part of the economy. They said, why are you publishing these stories? And I wasn't sure which way it would go, because the editors at the Chronicle, they treated me well, but they were not known for their bold, for their backbone necessarily. So I was afraid maybe they'd cave and tell me to stop writing these stories. So they listened politely to the chemical guys in suits. And then at the end they said, well, did he make a mistake? Are there any errors you can point out? And they said, well, no, but we just don't like the tone of these articles. And they said, there's the door. Nothing we can do. And to their credit, they didn't interfere with me. And I continued the rest of that year writing stories about the vinyl chloride industry. So that was the closest I came to. It was a kind of a defining moment. It was a test of my editor's spine. And they held up. They held up.
And in Texas, when you show up outside of a chemical plant with a camera.
Oh, there's a white security truck. It's always a white pickup truck.
They show up so fast. There's like no one
You just
around.
stand there for 5 seconds and there's a security guy.
Boom, I've been followed by cars.
Oh yeah, especially if you have a camera.
Oh yeah, I'm a filmmaker. I put cameras in lots of places.
Yeah, they're pretty paranoid.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for coming tonight. Thank you, Harry and Jim, for being here. Thank you so much for listening to the Chrysalis podcast. Please subscribe at johnfiege.earth, where you can also find show notes and all episodes of the podcast, plus my writing, photographs, and films. I want to send a very special thank you to all of our paid subscribers. Your membership allows us to grow, flourish, and remain free and ad-free for everyone. Your belief in the work that we're doing and your generous support mean the world to me and the podcast team. Thank you.